This story began sometime around my junior year of high school. I was 15 years old, and in that phase of my life where I didn't listen to anyone, yet at the same time was completely impressionable. At the beginning of the year, I was sitting in my 6th period chem class, probably zoned out, looking at my phone under the clunky gray lab table, when I heard two people laughing to my right. The way the classroom was set up was a long rectangle, so essentially the teacher wouldn't really be able to hear what was going on in the back. And the people laughing were a guy and a girl, Eric and Callie. They were somewhat popular, not the top of the food chain by any means, but everyone knew who they were. My younger sister knew Eric personally. They had a tennis match about a month or two earlier. Eric was really funny. That's a crucial element to this story. He was definitely the class clown. He was tall, good-looking, and extremely charismatic. I wasn't attracted to him, but I could see why everyone else was. I think it was at this point in time where I made one of the most regrettable decisions of my life. I decided I wanted to be friends with Eric. Eric was in my 2nd, 5th, and 6th periods. The next morning, I poked him in the back in Spanish class. "Hey," I said, "I heard my sister kicked your ass in tennis." He turned around with a goofy smile, his friends all looking at me. "Who's your sister?" His voice had a specific cadence to it. "Karen," I replied. I don't really remember the rest of this encounter, but I'm pretty sure he denied losing the tennis match. I think the conversation ended shortly thereafter, and my day continued until I saw him in math class. Algebra 2 was one of those classes where the teacher would lecture for a while, give us homework, and then let us have the rest of the period to work on it so we wouldn't have to do it when we got home. I was looking at my paper, probably confused, when I hear a familiar voice. "Hey, girl." I looked down and saw Eric crouched to my desk on the floor. "What's up?" He started asking me about tennis, and once I said that I played, a huge smile spread across his face. I think this is when he latched on to me. He asked for my phone number, and I gave it to him. That day, in our next period, he introduced me to Callie. She was older and really intimidating. I had never met anyone like her, and I was beginning to get excited at the prospect of these new, interesting friends. That night, he kept texting me non-stop. He would ask me questions and then would reply ha 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 to everything I said. I thought it was weird, but that was just his humor. After this day, he never left my side. We spent most of the school day together, and then would be in constant contact after school. This was 2011, so we were mostly on Facebook or doing group phone calls with Callie and 2 other friends of mine that I had brought into the group, Sasha and Natalie. There were lots of red flags. Eric wanted me to hold hands with him at school, and told everyone he had taken my virginity. For some reason, this wasn't something I got too mad about. I just thought it was weird. He would say, "Your virginity belongs to me." Again, I assumed it was a joke. I always assumed Eric wasn't attracted to girls because he said he wasn't, although he would have sex with them and tell everyone, making fun of them. He would walk down the hallway after 5th period, and he would stop for a group of freshman girls waiting for him, to give them each a peck on the lips. One time, we were walking to the bus, and there was a girl about 10 feet in front of us. She was cheating on her boyfriend, which I whispered to him, pointing her out. Yes, it was childish, but keep in mind this was high school, and I was 15. He proceeds to run towards her, stops her, only to point at me and tell her what I said. She came over and yelled at me, and he watched, laughing. A few months into the friendship, I began sneaking out with Eric, bringing him alcohol from my dad's liquor cabinet. Eric was a heavy drinker, especially considering our age. This came to a head when he asked Callie and I to come over one night. His dad was in prison and his mom was in rehab, so he lived with his grandparents. We pulled up outside his house and his car wasn't there. We waited for a while, and finally he sped into the neighborhood and stumbled out of the driver's side wasted. We followed him inside. His grandparents weren't home. I don't know what I said, but next thing I know, he grabs a knife off the kitchen counter and charges at me. I took off running and made it into Callie's car, slamming the door shut and locking it. He stares at me through the window before bursting out in laughter. My heart was racing, and my blood ran cold. Callie got into the car and we left. I don't know why I stuck around. It was almost like an abusive relationship. He told me he was the only guy who would ever find me attractive, but somehow it would turn into a joke and I would let it go. I believe the breaking point was when I heard about the baby squirrel. He had found a live baby squirrel after school and brought it home. His grandparents said they didn't want it in the house, so he walked outside and tossed it into the retention pond before walking back in. I wasn't there for that, but it disgusted me all the same. In algebra a few days later, he knocked my pen off my desk and called me a bitch. "Eric, I don't want to be friends with you anymore," I told him firmly. "Don't talk to me." His head snapped back, and he moved to the desk in front of mine. "You won't be able to ignore me," he laughed. "I know where to find you." "I'm going to college next year," I reminded him. "You'll never be able to get away from me." "Are you threatening me?" "Yes." I know this sounds like a cheesy horror movie, but that was our exchange word for word. The next week was endless phone calls, and him trying to get me to talk to him at school. At first it was jovial, when he thought I was going to change my mind. Then he came up to me in math class and opened his backpack. Inside there were several large kitchen knives. "In case there's a zombie attack." Another big smile. I should have told the teacher at that point. I really should have. But it wasn't until a few days later when he pushed me too far. "I'm going to rape you, then murder you, and I'll make Natalie film it." I went to the dean's office and told them everything. I had grown up being told not to snitch, but I couldn't focus on class anymore. I had been a good kid. I'd never been in trouble, so they believed what I told them. Here's the kicker. They called him into the office and he admitted to everything. Nodded, smiling, confirming all the stories I'd told them. Dean Thomas sat me down the next day and told me that I needed to call the police. They said there was clearly something wrong with him and that he didn't get it. They put a school version of a restraining order on him. He wasn't to talk to me, and during tests he had to be taken to a separate classroom. He would do everything he could to get around those rules. He would talk about me right in front of my face, but wasn't technically talking to me. He said out loud to the class, "Some girl put a restraining order on me because she thinks I'm dangerous." The teacher laughed and said, "Doesn't she know you're joking? That's just you being Eric, right?" The backlash I faced was enormous. All of his groupies shunned and laughed at me. Even my own friends said I was overreacting. Except for Natalie. She was always intuitive, and she said he made her feel very uncomfortable, and had started following her from class to class. When his birthday came, he approached me with Callie, and Callie said, "He wants you to wish him a happy birthday." Eventually, a mutual friend called me and told me Eric had threatened to kill himself if I wouldn't talk to him again. I went back to the dean's office. This time, every dean, vice principal, and even the principal got involved. My school was big, and there were 550 kids in my class. The school year ended, and without the protection of the authorities there, I was fielding more phone calls. When I blocked his number, he would just call me on Callie's phone. He would drive around my neighborhood to see if my car was in the driveway. He even came to my tennis matches, the ones we initially bonded over. I could see his silhouette in the fence watching me. By senior year, things had calmed down a bit. His attention was elsewhere, and I had picked my classes with the dean to ensure we weren't in any together. He was still watching. I would be walking down the hallway with someone he didn't know, and all of a sudden he would be walking with us next to my unassuming friend. "Hi, I'm Eric. Nice to meet you." He told my friends he had decided to wait for me, because we were soulmates and I'd come around eventually. I graduated high school and moved out of town. I told my new college friends that if something ever happened to me, he was the one who did it. And that's all. There's no conclusion, really. Except he always knows when I come into town. I don't know how because I blocked him on everything. I suspect he still stalks my house. He's been arrested since on drug charges and a few DUIs. I'm looking at his mugshots as I write this to remember those dead eyes. Sometimes, I think maybe I overreacted. Maybe it really was all a joke. You're looking for something better than a "he looked at me and it was creepy" story, huh? Well, here you are. Throwaway account, as this was an incredibly stressful time in my life, and I'd like to try and stay as anonymous as possible. I do admit this story has a very fine line between bizarre and abusive, but overall it's the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. In all honesty, I've had a lot of creepy encounters, known a lot of normal people that ended up doing very bad things. Sometimes I almost feel like I'm cursed to make friends with rough edges. This whole situation started when I was a sophomore in high school. I showed up to school one day and noticed a new boy in my class. I was your atypical goth girl, and this guy was a teenage bad boy dream. Piercings, leather jacket, reading some sort of obscure novel. I was hooked at first sight. I introduced myself, and soon enough we were dating. He will henceforth be referred to as X for the rest of the story. Now, for a little background. I was brought up in an alcoholic parent's home. There were many times I was living by myself or with a friend, because one of my parents was in the hospital. Despite the chaos in my family life, I still managed to go to school every day and pull in decent enough grades. After one time too many, however, I was left for 2+ months living alone. Instead of coming home to an empty house, I asked X if I could live with him since he was closer to school. He and his parents happily welcomed me into their home. At this point in the relationship, maybe 5 months in, we were phasing out of the puppy love stage, and I was starting to notice some very serious red flags. X was very mental and started cutting regularly. His parents were very heavy drug users. There would be times I would try talking to X and he would literally stare off into space and not notice my existence. He was never mean or abusive towards me, but I could definitely tell something was unhooking in him. When we started living together, it started to become very evident something was very, very wrong. He started to tell me he thought he was possessed by demons and couldn't control himself. We both spiraled into moderate drug use. I started skipping school, and he started seeing more of these demons. In all truth, I hadn't realized what a hole I had dug myself into by living with him. One night, we ended up falling asleep after smoking a bowl and watching a movie. It was a big house, and we were living in the garden-level basement, 2 or so floors below his parents and siblings. Around midnight, I was woken up by the most frightening screech I'd ever heard. X was right next to me in bed, contorting, convulsing, and screaming bloody murder. At first, I thought it was just a seizure. I've seen friends have seizures before, and I didn't interfere, only looking for one of our cell phones to call 911. As I got up out of the bed, he looked me dead in the eyes. The blood drained from my veins. I've never seen such hate. Everything seemed to happen in flashes from there. He never broke eye contact as he slowly rose from the bed. It almost looked as if he was a marionette on a set of strings, pulled up with sunken shoulders. A half-smile formed on his face as his body twitched. He started walking towards me. I can't describe how terrified I was, cornered in the room, opposite to the door. I felt my ears swell and ring. He started screeching at me, coming within a centimeter of my face, never breaking his gaze. I started pushing him, yelling at him to cut it out, but it was like trying to push away a stone statue. He would not move. He finally started talking, ranting about the demon and not making a single word of sense. As bizarre as it was, I knew he was having some sort of mental episode. I truly did fear for my life and knew I needed to escape. Suddenly, I felt as if I was sucked back into the moment, and my senses were incredibly acute. I noticed the window we had cracked open earlier. I pushed the window back, punched through the screen, and climbed out as he stood silently staring after me. I'm pretty sure I stayed outside for an hour, hyperventilating before I decided to ring the doorbell. One of his parents answered, very confused, and set me up with a blanket on the couch on the first floor with no questions asked. In the morning, X came up and acted as if nothing had happened, no matter how much I pestered him about it. It was as if it had all been a bad dream. I made arrangements to stay with another friend that day, and broke up with X about a week after, once I was actually able to face him again. Sometimes I wonder if it had been some sort of sick joke to get me out of his house or out of the relationship, but I watched unshocked in the years after, as he fell into severe drug abuse and mental illness. At one point, I went to a school counselor and told them how worried I was for him, but it only made him hold a grudge against me. After everything that happened, I really started to feel sorry for him, and sort of weirdly forgave him for what he did. He tried contacting me a few times after everything that happened, but as the years went by, I heard less and less. Last I heard, he was addicted to meth and living on the streets. This particular encounter still freaks me out. I know how horrible it could have ended, and I sometimes thank my crippling social anxiety, as well as general common sense, for preventing the worst. My freshman year of high school, when I was about 14, proved challenging socially. Afraid to really connect with strangers, I would typically eat lunch by myself or sit in the back of a classroom to avoid detection. I did have a few close friends from band, and I also grew fond of an equally awkward girl in my public speaking class. Now, because our public speaking teacher was also the drama teacher and cared much more about the musical than assigning us speeches, we never had to stand up in front of the class. Instead, I would walk into the room, sit down next to my friend, and talk to her for about an hour until the bell rang. After probably about 3 months, this class became a nightmare. I was walking through the halls one day in between classes when I was approached by a fellow freshman that I knew from band. She handed me a piece of paper and winked at me. "This is from Zach," she said. I believe that I stared at her rather blankly, earning me an eye roll. "The Zach that sits behind you in public speaking," she clarified. Still confused, but not wanting to appear stupid, I smiled, nodded, and thanked her. I put the note in my backpack and resolved to read it when I returned home that evening. Once in the comfort of my bedroom, I retrieved the note after recalling a very tall and large senior named Zach who did, in fact, sit behind me in that class. I didn't remember ever speaking to him, but thinking it might have been a message from the teacher, I opened the lined paper up. As I skimmed the words, I immediately became uncomfortable. Printed in sloppy handwriting was a cheesy love poem. In it, he described all of my physical features, mentioned my full name, which he spelled correctly, a feat which not many people can accomplish, and professed his undying love. Now, I was very, very confused. I had never even spoken to this kid. I only ever talked to the other freshmen in the class, and I had no account on any social media platform where he could have lifted the information. Even if I did know him, my mental issues would have definitely prevented any sort of long-term relationship. At this point, I was honestly a little more scared at the prospect of having to speak with someone I didn't know than the actual poem, but I still began to skip that particular class. After not attending public speaking for a good 2 weeks, I was eventually approached by a girl I knew from band, a fellow clarinet player by the name of Corey. "I heard you've been ditching," she said with a bit of a smirk. "Good girls don't ditch." When I just laughed and shrugged, she continued, "Well, your boyfriend thinks you're avoiding him." "What? That Zach guy? He's definitely not my boyfriend." "I have some classes with him too. I think he's a nice guy. You should give him a chance. He likes you a lot." Wanting to end the conversation, I just said that I would think about it and walked away. I think that Corey told Zach what I had said, and things started to escalate. I received a similar poem taped to my locker a few days later, and I began to see Zach standing outside of my classes as I left. Because he was blocking the door, I had no choice but to talk to him. I don't remember the exact conversation, but I remember that he pulled out a large black binder and handed it to me. He told me that he was a writer, and that all the pages were filled with poems for me. After flipping through some very cringe-worthy writing, I believe that I thanked him, not wanting to hurt any feelings. He interpreted this as a go-ahead for a kiss, and I became pinned to a wall. And this guy was well over 200 pounds, so he had quite the advantage physically against a small 14-year-old girl. When he finally came up for air, smiling like he had just won the ultimate prize, I told him that I was running late for my next class and he released me. I felt assaulted and even more freaked out, but I never told anyone about this. I never told anyone even when he began to wait for me by my brother's car. He went to the same school and drove me home. I never told anyone even when I saw Zach walking through my neighborhood, staring at houses intently like he was trying to figure out which one was mine. I had to change all of the routes I took to get to my classes, and I would sneak out back doors just to avoid him. I guess I figured that the school year was almost over, and once he graduated, my problems would resolve themselves. However, about a month later, I was leaving the school with a couple of band friends. It was around midnight after a musical performance. I was in the pit orchestra, and we were going to grab a bite to eat at a village inn. As I made my way to my friend's car, I felt hands grasp me around my waist. Spinning around in fright, I noticed Zach had pinned me against a different car. "I haven't seen you in a while," he said. "But that's okay. Love transcends time." I think I just smiled uncomfortably and said something about being busy with the musical. He ran a hand up my back and wrapped it around the back of my neck. "I know you're super busy, and that got me thinking. I love you more than anything, and I know that we're young, and I know that I don't have a ring, but please run away with me. Please marry me." Completely stunned and paralyzed, one of my friends arrived. She overheard the conversation and picked up on how freaked out I was, and she swooped in. "Hey," she said. "We have to leave right now. Sorry. My mom wants me home in like 5 minutes, and she'll not be happy if I'm late. Come on." She grabbed my arm and wiggled my body free from Zach. "Wait, so will you?" Zach asked as my friend dragged me away. I said something stupid about having to think about it, and I made my way into my friend's car without any other problems. We laughed and joked about it later, but it scared me enough to take my cautiousness to the next level. For the rest of the school year, I made complex plans on how to travel between classes so I wouldn't have to see him, and I made sure that I walked to and from any car with a group of people. Again, I never told anyone, even though an 18-year-old adult man proposing to and stalking a young girl was more than not okay. I wish I had, though, and I wish it had ended there. A few years ago, when I was about 21, I was scrolling through my Facebook page when, all of a sudden, messages from people I hadn't talked to in years began flooding in. They all said something along the lines of, "Holy shit, this is creepy. Oh my god, are you okay?" And they included links to a news article. Apparently, Zach had been arrested for the possession of child pornography and for multiple counts of molestation against a minor. A couple of the girls mentioned in the article I even knew from high school. I was pretty decent friends with them too, even though they were freshmen when I was a senior. I just hoped that he didn't hurt them because they were friends with me. He's in jail now for a very long time. However, if you search my name through Google, you'll still find books that Zach actually published, containing hundreds of poems that he dedicated to me. But honestly, I'm just glad that he's locked up and unable to hurt any more girls.